What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved stars gets ambushed on live television by a host who clearly didn't do his homework? Tonight, we're diving into the shocking confrontation that had Gal Gadot walking off Jimmy Kimmel's show, leaving audiences stunned and the host scrambling to save face. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in how not to treat your guests. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment, because this story gets more uncomfortable by the minute. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. Gal Gadot had arrived at the studio in good spirits, fresh off promoting her latest project. She'd done hundreds of interviews before, always maintaining her characteristic grace and professionalism. What she didn't expect was to walk into what felt more like an interrogation than a friendly chat show appearance as the cameras rolled and the audience applauded. Jimmy Kimmel's opening seemed normal enough. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the absolutely stunning Gal Gadot," he announced with his trademark grin. But there was something different about his demeanor tonight, something that seasoned industry observers would later describe as unusually aggressive. Gal settled into the guest chair, her smile warm and genuine as she waved to the enthusiastic crowd. "Thank you so much for having me, Jimmy. It's great to be here," she said, her accent adding its usual charm to her words. "Oh, the pleasure is all mine," Jimmy replied, but his tone carried an undertone that made the seasoned actress slightly raise an eyebrow. "So Gal, I have to ask, and I know our audience is dying to know, how does it feel to be called the least authentic person in Hollywood?" The question hit like a slap. The studio audience fell silent, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that makes everyone wish they were anywhere else. Gal's smile faltered for just a moment before she composed herself with the professionalism that had carried her through years in the spotlight. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" she asked, her voice steady but clearly taken aback. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, seemingly pleased with the reaction he'd provoked. "Oh, come on, don't act surprised. There's been talk, about how everything you do seems calculated, rehearsed. People are saying you're not the genuine person you pretend to be." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Gal shifted in her seat, her media training kicking in as she tried to navigate this unexpected attack. "Jimmy, I'm not sure where you're getting this information, but I've always been authentic in my interviews and my work. I'm just here to talk about my new film." Right. "The new film," Jimmy said, waving his hand dismissively. "But let's be honest here. Isn't it true that you only got the Wonder Woman role because you knew someone? I mean, your acting experience? Before that was pretty limited, wasn't it?" The host's research was not only wrong, but deliberately inflammatory. Anyone who had followed Gal's career knew she had earned her breakthrough role through auditions and screen tests, competing against numerous other actresses. But Jimmy seemed determined to paint a different picture. Gal's jaw tightened slightly, though she maintained her composure. "That's absolutely not true, Jimmy. I auditioned for Wonder Woman like every other actress who was considered. I went through multiple rounds of screen tests and callbacks. It was a very competitive process." Sure, Jimmy said with a smirk. That suggested he didn't believe a word she was saying. But you have to admit, being Miss Israel probably didn't hurt your chances, right? I mean, that's pretty convenient for a superhero role. The implication was clear and insulting. Jimmy was suggesting that her pageant background, rather than her acting ability, had landed her the career-defining role. It was the kind of reductive thinking that many actresses face, but rarely so blatantly on a major talk show. "Jimmy, I'm starting to feel like you didn't invite me here for an actual interview," Gal said, her voice remaining calm but with a steel edge creeping in. "Are you trying to make some kind of point, or are we going to have a respectful conversation?" The host chuckled, but it wasn't a warm sound. "Oh, I'm just asking the questions that people want answered. Isn't that what journalism is about? Getting to the truth." "This isn't journalism," Gal replied firmly. "This is ambush television, and it's beneath both of us." Jimmy's expression shifted, his media-trained smile becoming more predatory as he sensed he was getting under his guest's skin. The studio lights seemed harsher now, casting unflattering shadows as the tension in the room became palpable. Members of the production crew exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing that this interview had veered far from the typical celebrity chat format. "Ambush television," Jimmy repeated, feigning offense. "Gal, I'm just doing my job here. You're a public figure, you put yourself out there, and sometimes that means answering tough questions. Isn't that part of the deal when you become famous? Gal's posture straightened, her years of military training evident in the way she held herself. There's a difference between tough questions and baseless accusations. Jimmy, you're presenting rumors and speculation as if they're facts, and that's not professional journalism by any standard. The host leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, in a gesture that was meant to appear casual but came across as confrontational. Okay, let's talk about professionalism then. What about all those reports of you being difficult to work with? Multiple sources have said you're demanding on set, that you throw tantrums when things don't go your way. This was news to everyone, including Gal herself. Her reputation in Hollywood was actually quite the opposite, known for her kindness to crew members and collaborative approach with directors. Jimmy was either grossly misinformed or deliberately fabricating controversy for ratings. Jimmy, I'm going to need you to cite those sources, Gal said, her voice taking on a lawyer-like precision, because what you're describing is completely contrary to my actual reputation in this industry. I've worked with the same crews multiple times, specifically because we have great working relationships. Oh, you want me to name names? That's not how this works, Gal. Sources are protected. But trust me, the stories are out there. People talk in this town, and they're saying you're not the sweet, humble person you play in public. The audience was growing increasingly uncomfortable. Had started as anticipation for a fun celebrity interview, had devolved into something that felt voyeuristic and cruel. Some audience members were shifting in their seats, others checking their phones, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Gal took a deep breath, her media training warring with her natural instinct to defend herself more forcefully. Jimmy, I've been in this industry long enough to know that there are always people willing to spread rumors about successful women. But the directors I've worked with, from Patty Jenkins to Zack Snyder to Kenneth Branagh, they've all invited me back. For multiple projects, that doesn't happen if you're difficult to work with, right? But maybe they're just being polite, Jimmy suggested with a shrug that was calculated to appear casual. Maybe they don't want to deal with the backlash of saying anything negative. About Wonder Woman herself, you've got quite the fan base after all. Some might say they're a bit intense. Now, Jimmy was not only attacking Gal personally, but also taking shots at her fans, suggesting they were somehow threatening or problematic. It was a multi-pronged assault that seemed designed to provoke rather than inform or entertain. It's my fans are passionate people who appreciate representation and positive storytelling. Gal replied, her voice steady despite the mounting frustration. They're not intense in any negative way. They're supporters of the character and the values Wonder Woman represents it. Jimmy chuckled again, that same cold sound that was becoming his signature for the evening. Values? Right. Let's talk about values. What about your military service? Some people are saying that's just another calculated move to make yourself look more heroic, more worthy of playing a superhero. Pretty convenient timing, don't you think? The question was so absurd and offensive that for a moment, Gal was speechless. Her military service was mandatory in Israel, something she had completed years before ever considering an acting career. To suggest it was somehow calculated for Hollywood. Success was not only factually wrong, but deeply insulting to her service and her country. Jimmy, that question is so ignorant I'm not even sure how to respond, Gal said, her composure finally beginning to crack. Military service is mandatory in Israel. I served my country like millions of other Israelis have. It had nothing to do with Hollywood or acting or any kind of career calculation. I was 18 years old. But you do talk about it a lot in interviews, Jimmy pressed. You bring it up whenever you want to, seem tough or credible. Isn't that kind of exploiting your service for personal gain? The accusation was particularly galling because Gal typically only discussed her military service when directly asked about it, and even then, she was usually modest about the experience. Jimmy was twisting her respectful acknowledgement of her service into something mercenary and self-serving. I mention it when people ask about my background, which is what any honest person would do. Gal replied, her voice rising slightly for the first time, and I certainly don't exploit it. I'm proud of my service, just as I'm proud of my country, and I won't apologize for either of those things. The host sensed he had found a particularly sensitive nerve and decided to press harder, speaking of your country. There's been some controversy about your political statements, hasn't there? Some people are saying you're too political for a superhero actress, that you should stick to entertaining people instead of pushing agendas. This line of questioning revealed the true nature of Jimmy's attack. He wasn't interested in legitimate interview topics or even Hollywood gossip. He was venturing into political territory, trying to bait Gal into saying something controversial, or getting her to defend positions that would alienate parts of her fan base. I've always been very careful to separate my personal political views from my professional work, Gal said, her training as both an actress and a former service member helping her maintain control. When I do speak out, it's about universal values like peace, equality, and human dignity. I hardly think those are controversial positions. But some of your fans disagree, Jimmy said, pulling out what appeared to be printed social media posts. I've got some tweets here calling you out for various statements. Want me to read a few? The move was theatrical and cruel, designed to embarrass Gal by reading negative comments about her on national television. It was the kind of stunt that revealed more about the host's character than his guests, but Jimmy seemed oblivious to how poorly this reflected on him. Jimmy, anyone with a public platform receives criticism, Gal said, her patience clearly wearing thin. Cherry-picking negative comments to read on your show isn't journalism, it's just mean-spirited entertainment at my expense. The final straw came when Jimmy set down the printed tweets and leaned back with what could only be described as a satisfied smirk. The studio audience had gone from uncomfortable to actively hostile toward their host, with several people in the front rows shaking their heads visibly. The energy in the room had shifted completely, and not in Jimmy's favor. "You know what, Gal?" Jimmy said, his tone taking on an even more condescending quality. "I think what really bothers people is that you always seem to have this perfect answer for everything, like you're reading from a script. It's almost like you're not a real person, just this carefully constructed image." The personal attack was delivered with such casual cruelty that even the production crew seemed stunned. This wasn't interview technique or probing journalism. This was simply a host tearing down his guest for reasons that remained unclear to everyone watching. Gal sat in silence for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, clearly processing not just the words but the entire bizarre trajectory of the interview. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority. "Jimmy, I came here tonight to talk about my work, to connect with your audience, and to have what I hoped would be an enjoyable conversation. Instead, you've spent the last 20 minutes making personal attacks, spreading false information, and trying to humiliate me on national television." "Oh, come on," Jimmy interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic. This is just how interviews work. You ask questions, you get answers. If you can't handle a little pressure, maybe you shouldn't be in this business." The dismissive response was the final insult. Gal had endured military service, built an international career, and handled countless interviews with grace and professionalism. For Jimmy to suggest she couldn't handle pressure was not only wrong, but revealed his complete ignorance of who he was actually talking to. "A little pressure," Gal repeated, her voice rising with controlled anger. "Jimmy, you've accused me of being fake, of getting roles through connections rather than talent, of exploiting my military service, and of being difficult to work with. None of these accusations are based on facts. This isn't pressure. This is character assassination." Jimmy seemed to realize he had pushed too far, but instead of backing down, he doubled down with nervous laughter. "Look, I'm just reporting what's out there. Don't shoot the messenger, right? I mean, if there weren't some truth to these things, would people be talking about them?" "People aren't talking about them," Gal said firmly, standing up from her chair. "You're talking about them. You're creating controversy where none exists, and you're doing it at my expense for what I can only assume is some kind of ratings grab." Host's demeanor shifted as he realized his guest was preparing to leave. Panic crept into his voice as he tried to regain control of the situation. Whoa, where are you going? We're not done here. You can't just walk away from an interview." "Actually, I can," Gal said, beginning to remove her microphone. "I'm a guest on your show, Jimmy, not a prisoner. And I won't sit here and be insulted for your entertainment or anyone else's." Jimmy's mask of casual confidence finally slipped. "Completely, Gal. Come on, sit back down. Let's talk about your movie. That's what you're here for, right?" let's get back to that. The sudden shift in tone was jarring. After spending the entire interview attacking his guest, Jimmy was now trying to pivot to the promotional content that should have been the focus from the beginning. But it was too late. The damage was done, and Gal's patience was exhausted. Had 20 minutes to talk about my movie, Jimmy. Instead, you chose to turn this into some kind of hit piece. I'm not sure what I did to deserve this treatment, but I'm not going to participate in it any longer. The studio audience, which had been silent for most of the confrontation, began to murmur among themselves. Some were clearly supportive of Gal's decision to leave, while others seemed confused about what they had just witnessed. The energy in the room was chaotic. With the production crew scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation, Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage the interview. Look, maybe I came on a little strong, but that's just my style. That's what people expect from late-night television, edgy, provocative content. It's nothing personal. Gal paused in her exit, turning back to face the host one final time. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment and pity. Jimmy, there's a difference between edgy and cruel. There's a difference between provocative and dishonest. What you did tonight wasn't entertainment, it was just mean. The simple truth of her words seemed to hit Jimmy harder than any angry outburst could have. He sat behind his desk, suddenly looking smaller, as his guest walked toward the exit with her head held high. "Gal, please," he called out one more time, his voice cracking slightly. Can we start over? I'll ask different questions." But Gal had already reached the edge of the stage. She turned to the audience, many of whom were now openly applauding her decision to leave, and gave them a gracious wave. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, addressing the crowd directly. "I'm sorry you had to witness this." As she disappeared backstage, Jimmy was left alone at his desk, facing an audience that was no longer on his side, and cameras that had captured every moment of his professional meltdown. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the awkward shuffling of papers and the distant sound of Gal's heels clicking down the hallway as she made her dignified exit. And that's how one of Hollywood's most respected actresses ended, up walking off one of television's biggest talk shows. Leaving behind a host who had confused cruelty with creativity and aggression with entertainment, what did you think of Jimmy's behavior in this interview? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think Gal handled this situation the right way. And don't forget to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories that you won't hear anywhere else.